The Comox Valley Regional District Electoral Area Services Committee for Monday, October 21st. And seeing no one in the gallery, we don't need to go through the preamble. Everybody knows the story. But we will, of course, acknowledge that we are doing our business today on the traditional unceded territory of the Comox First Nation people. No delegations, no management report. But we do have a report here for receipt about the asset management planning for the Comox Valley Water Local Service Area. For receipt. One second on receipt. And over to
Chris LaRose, who will provide an outline of the report and answer your questions.
Thank you, through the chair. And to members of the committee.
same PowerPoint.
Yeah, similar PowerPoint. Yeah, so this will be quite familiar to some of you, but I'll walk through this one in detail for the sake of the other directors, and then for the second report, I'll just jump to the salient points. So this report and presentation outline the recent asset management planning work that was done for the Function 305, the Comox Valley Water Local Service Area. So we've got a short PowerPoint to walk you through it. But first, just want to highlight that this work's not being done in isolation. It's actually part of a corporate-wide effort to incorporate asset management into the way that we manage our services to ensure sustainable service delivery over the long term. As part of that work, we have a working group in place consisting of key management staff from across the organization, representing those departments with key infrastructure. The group has met regularly. And in addition to this work, we've done the similar work in the other water local service areas, as well as the regional water service, the regional sewer service, and then more recently in the solid waste and recreation services as well. So the results of this work is being pulled together, so summarized to the individual committees, pulled together, and then will inform a cohesive direction forward. And in parallel with this work that's been done this year, we've also been recruiting for a manager of asset management position to help oversee this process and help develop that cohesive approach across the services. So I'll get started. So the AECOM was hired as through a competitive process last year. To help progress the asset management plans or planning a little bit at the corporate level. So they were hired to part of their scope was to develop a corporate policy. And then they focused in on strategies for water and wastewater, solid waste and rec, and the asset management plans for each of the individual services. So asset management planning is becoming a standard best practice for the delivery of services. At the local government level, and they are also increasingly required or strongly desired for grant funding as well. So the province is definitely pushing local governments in this direction. So put simply, asset management planning involves getting a very detailed understanding of what assets we have. That's the first step, is to understand what we have out there before we can understand how to manage those assets. It makes sense. It's an intuitive approach, and then it combines that kind of clear understanding of what we have out there, which includes when it was put in, what was put in, when it was put in, and combining that with other attributes that help us assess the risk and the criticality associated with each of these assets, and that informs decisions about when these assets should be replaced. So for the Comox Valley Water Local Service Area, the assets are largely composed of linear. So we call it linear infrastructure. That's pipes that are in the ground, pipes and valves, essentially. We don't have any dedicated treatment infrastructure for this service, and I don't believe there are any direct reservoirs owned by this service either. So it's quite a straightforward plan for this service, as it is almost entirely linear infrastructure. And we worked with AECOM to develop a replacement schedule based on that combination of expected service life, the condition of the infrastructure where possible. So clearly, it's one thing to inspect the condition of an above-ground vertical infrastructure such as a pump or a reservoir. It's more challenging to inspect pipe in the ground because it's not as accessible. So we do have some information for condition, and this is an example of how iterative asset management planning is. So you work with the best information that you have, and then you work to improve that information over time. And as you do, you update the plan, and therefore thereby increase the quality of the result. So at the moment, the data we have for condition is fairly low, so we make assumptions for condition. And just as we make assumptions for criticality and risk, which I'll touch on the next slide. So this slide delves into the concept of the expected service life, because it's a pretty integral to the asset management planning process, because clearly the assumptions you make about expected service life are, in a large part, drive the schedule of replacement. So this graph illustrates the Weibull curve, the Weibull distribution curve that accurately predicts the rate of or the probability of failure, which is the POF on the vertical left-hand column there, or the axis, versus the age of the infrastructure. So the only variance between the different types of infrastructure, be it vertical or linear, or even some wildly different infrastructure, is the slope of that curve. So how steep it is, how steep it falls from low to high risk. So this one pulled out of the asset management plan from AECOM, and it predicts the probability of asset failure and relates it to the risk calculation. So what this is highlighting, key takeaways from the graph, are that so at 100% of ESL, so using the asbestos cement pipe that we have in the ground for the Service 305. So we've assumed, based on industry best practice and industry standard, that that pipe should have a lifespan of about 60 years. So what this graph shows is that, and this is quite predictable, that about 65% of those assets will require replacement by that 60-year period. There will be some pipes that will require that will fail and require replacement earlier on due to a combination of criticality and ground conditions, potentially some other influencing factors like the quality of the manufacturer and the quality of the installation. But by 60 years, about 63% of that pipe will have failed, and the remaining sections of pipe will continue to fail until most of it has failed, by approximately 100 years. So that forms a key input into the assessment of the risk associated with the sections of linear pipe. So this map shows first of all, the distribution systems that are part of the 305 system. And so that graph we just looked at on the previous page is now put in down here as one input to this risk calculation. So what the output from this flow chart here is risk. It's hard to read, so I'll walk you through it. So risk is the equivalent to the likelihood of failure multiplied by the consequence of failure. So that graph on the previous page does a pretty good job of communicating the likelihood of failure of those pipes based on with respect to the age. The other piece is consequence, and we've broken that, or AECOM has broken that down into 4 categories. So the economic risk of a failure of any given piece of that pipe, the operational impact of failure, the social impact of failure, and the environmental impact of failure. So taken together, we then assign each of those sections a consequence of failure, and when combined with the age effectively, that outputs a risk. And this graphic here highlights in green, yellow, and red, risk rating of those sections of pipe. Red being sections that are in imminent need of replacement to mitigate an elevated risk, an unacceptably high level of risk. Green being fine for now, and yellow being some elevated risk, but not sufficient to justify replacement at this point in time. So working with the inventory and then the risk assessment and the condition, to a lesser extent, the condition assessment, AECOM output a asset replacement schedule. So this graph here, so with the legend at the bottom, highlighting the different types of infrastructure. So very simple for this, as I highlighted in an earlier slide, for this particular service, we really only have linear infrastructure. So that's represented as blue and as distribution in this case. So this service, what this graph is showing is that this service has significant in-ground linear infrastructure that is in need of replacement within this 20-year horizon. So first of all, the concept of the 20-year horizon is common across the board for asset management. It's considered the minimum horizon for looking out at the upcoming infrastructure liabilities. So that's what the first thing this graph shows you. And a note about this graph, it assumes that all infrastructure will be replaced at its expected lifespan. So for the asbestos cement pipe, it assumes that it'll be replaced as soon as it hits 60 years old. So what that means is when looking at this, you can deduce that 60 years prior to 2030 there was some pipe put in the ground, and same goes for each of these years. So much of the existing infrastructure for 305 was built 60 years prior to these 3 years here. And as you'll see on the next slide, there is an alternative way to display this, because this particular graph does not take into account the Weibull distribution of the probability of failure of infrastructure. So what this generates on a asset replacement schedule is more of a bell curve, where these big replacements are spread out, but in acknowledgement of the fact that some of that infrastructure will likely fail earlier and some of it will fail after. But just taken at this simplistic level at this point, because this is a preliminary look at the results, and when we haven't delved into the detail of the financial analysis and rate analysis. So taken at this point, what this is telling us is that based on the scale of these replacements that are required in the latter third of the current 20-year horizon, the annual average value of that taken over the next 20 years is 1.9 million, which is a big number. There's no getting around that. So what we've just started to do is look at the financial analysis. This was, I guess, build a financial model that incorporates that's able to develop and output various rate scenarios. So that's something that we plan to do over the coming months and into 2020, and before we're coming back to the committee with a more detailed assessment of the required annual reinvestment rate. But this is pulled out of that other system, and that it was developed by Econics. Econics was engaged several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, to take a look at asset management for the regional district. Now, since that point in time, the field of asset management has grown significantly, and what we've undertaken here with AECOM is a much more rigorous approach to the subject. But Econics is still very much an expert in the field of financial analysis and rate analysis. So this is their asset replacement schedule. They took our inventory, the same one that AECOM used to design that or develop that previous graph, but they applied that distribution type curve to the asset replacements, and it comes up with this arguably more realistic distribution of cost for the service. So what you can see, I guess, key takeaways from this particular service and this graph is that Service 305 is facing by far the biggest capital spending hump in it over the next 100 years falls within the next 25 years. So it's not a great time for the service. And you'll see when we compare that to the next service that it looks quite different. So this is unique to the Service 305, and it's a reflection of the age of the infrastructure that was inherited when these service areas were taken over by the regional district and eventually coalesced into the Service 305. So the attached asset management plan from AECOM included a number of recommendations which are summarized here. At this point, and as we highlighted at the beginning of the presentation, we're working on a corporate-wide effort to incorporate asset management practices into our systems, and these recommendations will be considered and brought forward, considered together, and then brought forward as part of the corporate strategy in 2020, and guided by the respective committees. In the meantime, we will be working on a detailed rate analysis, the financial model and rate analysis for Service 305. So at this point, given the critically low levels of our current projected reserve contributions, which have been coming down year by year over the last several years, as we've to be frank, the asset management planning has taken longer than we had hoped. And while we've been aware that a rate increase is required for this service, we've been putting it off so that we can do it at the same time as these asset management driven increases. But at this point, even though we're not forecasting being fully complete this work and the associated financial planning until middle to late next year, we're recommending that an increase of 9% be implemented immediately to help the service. So that would start to bring reserve contributions up. It will somewhat help to mitigate the subsequent rate increases, and certainly in the short term mitigate the risk of a deficit in this service. If that recommendation is approved, next steps would include providing a newsletter as part of the January bill for the service. I guess that would be, this is on the triennial billing, so that's a typo. So this would be providing a newsletter immediately informing the residents of an increase starting in April 1st. We'll continue with the hiring process of the manager of asset management. And something I didn't touch on, which was touched on as a recommendation from AECOM, but what we already had in place was initiation of a computerized maintenance management system for the water service, which 305 would benefit from significantly. And then in 2020, we would be working to move towards board approval of the corporate asset management policy, and then that comprehensive financial modeling and rate review for each of the water services. And that's all from me.
Okay, starting with questions. Director Hamir.
Thanks for the report, Chris. So I won't go into the rate increase right now, but I just had a few questions about, how the asset management is getting paid for. So the person that will be hired for asset management, will their pay be coming out of this service 305, and who pays into this service?
The asset management is a shared service provided across the board, so we funded by recreation, sewer, water,
so everyone's
distribution systems.
Contributing to this?
Contributing to it.
Okay, that helps. So just a general question, we just had Black Creek Oyster Bay have a 5% increase, so I'm wondering what the discrepancy is, between their increase and ours. Is it just the age of the?
Age and demand, but the 9% was something that was budgeted for. It was previously in the 5-year financial plan, so
Okay.
isn't a surprise, and that's why we're going at that number. But as Chris alluded to, subsequent to this, you will have to develop a plan that will see further increases in the future, or a strategy that
Past
is
the
going to-
9%?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so are the folks that have joined the water service, like I'm thinking particularly Sandwick, were they aware that this was going to be coming?
So we've certainly been talking about asset management in our communications. Are they aware of the scale of the likely increases coming? No.
Okay. And then I saw 2 of the red, like on the map of the water service. The 2 red points, one looks like in Area C, one in Area B, but I didn't see in the timeline of replacement anything coming up soon. Like, are those red dots, like how critical is critical, and when do those need to be replaced?
That's a good question. Just 1 second. Yeah, sorry for not having a quick answer on that one. So the infrastructure that shows up on the asset replacement schedule is, if it's risk driven, as in being replaced before the expected lifespan is up for that infrastructure, sorry, I should rephrase that. Only infrastructure that has a risk rating of higher than 10 shows up as being replaced in advance of the
Lives.
expected lifespan. So I guess what the implication is that this map here is showing the top 40 per Zoe, the highest top 40 risk rating in this system, but that's still not over the risk
Okay.
rating of 10. So as what we would expect, as because I highlighted here, risk is the consequence times probability. As we progress, as we add years to that infrastructure, it could push it up over the 10, in which case it could show up earlier on the asset replacement schedule.
Okay.
So I have a short answer is at the moment, at the moment, those elevated risk sections that are identified are not past that threshold.
Okay. Now, coming to the rate increase, that's going to be a bit of a tough pill to swallow, especially because so many of these folks are in Area B. And I'm just wondering how communications would be rolled out, because I think if it's seen that, some of this money is going to be hiring an asset manager, I don't know how well that will go over with the electorate. They're going to want to see something that, the tangible benefits, for their water service. So I don't know if staff have thought about how this could be messaged and to soften the blow, but and then, I overheard what Director Lee was saying previously, if it's possible to do a gradual increase and go above 9% later, but to start at a lower amount for the first couple of years and have it increase. And I know there's going to be more increases, but that it's still, a lot of.
And communications is everything, you're right. Chris has drawn to your attention the hiring of the asset manager, because we need you to know that there is this person coming, but
Okay.
actually it is an expense that has been budgeted for the
okay.
last 2 years, so
Good.
that won't be new, but definitely how we roll this out and how we inform the public will be critical.
Yeah.
Maybe a quick question. So did you have in mind, it sounds like you had in mind the the recommended 9% increase when you were asking about communication messaging
Yeah.
rather than the future
Yeah.
more significant increases.
Yeah.
So we've certainly put our mind, and the plan, which was highlighted at the end and next steps, is to circulate a newsletter that provides an update on the asset management process, a description or an explanation that this increase, was foreseen in the existing financial plan, and that future information will be brought forward once the asset management process is complete next year. That's in a simplistic way, that's what we were planning. I just brought us back to this slide here, just I guess to put it in context. What AECOM's work is showing is that the annual cost of sustainable ownership for this service, they're highlighting at 1.9 million per year. And when we work through our financial modeling and the rate analysis, we'll be looking to balance future borrowing, anticipate realistic grant funding opportunities to try and offset some of those, kind of the weight on the existing users. And when we do finally bring that back, we'll likely bring back scenarios that we can discuss and potentially even do some live modeling with the committee. So in other words, this number doesn't assume any future borrowing or grant funding. But to put it in perspective, the current revenue for this service is more than the current annual revenue for this service.
Right.
So so while we will almost certainly be looking to balance future borrowing and hopefully obtain grant funding, there are likely very significant increases coming for this service in well in excess of the 9%.
But if we did receive, future grants or, something in the future, would we then reduce that tax requisition, or it's set at a certain rate, just in case we don't? Like, how does that work when we do apply for grants?
Yes, we'll make when we're doing our modeling to support the rate analysis, we will make assumptions, like I said, realistic assumptions on grant funding, and then that increased revenue will help fund larger contributions to reserves. But as we will continue to seek and exploit all opportunities for grant funding, and our level of success at obtaining grant funding will not affect our revenue requirements. If we're more successful than anticipated at grant funding, then that will lighten the borrowing load for the subsequent round of infrastructure requirements. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
And if we're less, it'll exacerbate it.
So just to be clear, Chris, it's not a tax. It's based on consumption, right?
Yes. So in our financial modeling and rate analysis that we'll do in 2020, we will look to part of what we'll come back to is a recommendation on how to split the revenue requirements between consumption and tax, parcel tax. So at the moment, this is recommended to be entirely consumption. Sorry, I'm just looking over at Kevin.
Yeah. Because they're all different models, aren't they? All the different water services we joined up. Some are a bit of this and a bit of that, parcel tax. Turn you on.
Thank you once again to the chair, to the directors. So as Chris alluded to, yes, we will definitely be coming back with some potential funding models and looking at all of those revenue sources collectively. With asset management, typically, you would look to your parcel tax as, kind of the first step into funding your asset management. That's really what those parcel taxes are there to do. But given, again, the mix of revenue sources within these systems, and because of their impetus, we will be looking at kind of a broader overall mix of, how much should that come from tax? How much should that come from your consumption? Because again, your utility rates at the end of the day should be first and foremost ensuring that you're collecting the full cost recovery of operating the system. Yeah. If there's dollars left over after that, then definitely we can be looking at how then those contribute to your overall asset management strategy, which is why we want to look at that balance. Right now, for the most part, most of our water services have relied on that consumption component. We want to look at kind of the bigger picture approach and say, so what should that mix really be now, given some of the sizable reinvestments that we have to make? To give you some perspective, again, this report indicates that we should be, putting away, roughly $1.9 million a year. Right now, what we're typically putting away in our reserve is less than a tenth of that. About 150,000 or so a year, outside of any potential additional contributions from things like surpluses or things of that nature. So again, we're not saying we necessarily have to go, full meal deal, but this is just to give kind of that, big long-term picture. And then, the intent over the next, several months will be to fine tune that, look at, our specific needs with respect to risk and criticality and all of those things to bring back to you a more fulsome approach.
Subsequent?
I think if it was all on consumption, like right away a 10% increase could actually force a lot of water conservation. And you may just lose a lot of that funding that comes in because people see that so abruptly that, maybe they'll stop watering their lawns and doing all of that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess there's that risk there that if you put it all on consumption, that can happen.
Yeah. And if I may, through the chair to directors, we've also had that conversation, and that's something we will definitely be considering when bringing forward some recommendations.
It's like recycling. Okay. Director Daniel.
So just to be clear, so this recommendation is that it will be fully allocated to consumption for this increase, but that next year we'll be looking to carefully balance that. So when we do bring forward recommendations for further revenue, it'll be balanced between parcel tax and user rates.
I think you've done really sound work so far. And I guess it goes back to, in the rural areas, we tend to have two types of households. We have those that just manage to failure in their systems and their houses and all the rest of that. And then we have those that do planned maintenance. It's like when you buy a car. Are you going to go every year, or are you just going to ride that new car for 10 years and then see what problems arise? So I guess the approach where we're planning to adapt is more planned maintenance. I think as a public body, it just makes sense. And probably this, I don't know if there is, but there may be a case that is actually more economic in the long term. I don't know if you can afford it in the short term. Let's see, I'll just go back, just a brief note. I think because we're introducing sort of a regime around that, around asset management. If I just received that in the newsletter to my house, that's fine, but I would love to see in that newsletter to say, hey, want to find out more, come to the open house. Put in a little open house for residents who might be interested in getting more in depth and receiving the kind of rationale and information that you just put forward. Doesn't mean that you'll have a lot of people, but to have the opportunity rather than just a fait accompli announced in the newsletters, like what's my recourse, right? To just give an opportunity for people to ask questions, or I think that would be worthwhile. And the other thing that's missing, maybe for me in the report and the long report, and I get lost because it's obviously an engineering technical report. But going back to that question of planned maintenance versus managing to failure, what's missing for me is infrastructure quality, right? So I have questions around what are the scales of infrastructure that we are putting in. Do we have a choice between the $10 PVC versus the $100 galvanized? I don't know, right, from an engineering standpoint, but that is a question to me, whether I imagine there's more than one option when you upgrade those distribution systems. So that question to me is not really answered in the report, and I would love more information in the future around how that's assessed, or whether there's really just one solution to those things, and because of standards and regulation, there's really only one thing you can do. So that's the kind of question I would have, because it's like, am I buying a BMW or am I buying a, a little Nissan Micra or something, right? When you put in that infrastructure. Other than that, yeah, no, I'm really happy to see this work, and I'm glad that the entire organization is catching it at this time. I'm supportive of planned maintenance myself, but I can imagine for sure some constituents will have those questions. And so going back to that value of an open house or different forms of engagement, not too onerous on us, but just so people have an opportunity to talk it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. That's a very good suggestion. I think that you can't over-consult. You can't just spin something and walk away from it. You're going to have to stand behind it. So the other question is, are you going to go for double-walled stainless steel pipes that'll be good for 1,000 years, or for some kind of pipeliner that just goes in the existing pipes and seals them up for another 20 years or something? So I think that was brought up by Director Lee as well. My question is around assessing the pipes in the ground. Do they actually do it with like a pipe eye kind of thing? Can they go into the pipes and visually inspect the runs, or?
Yep. So that we can definitely do that. So that's one option, is to do a proactive type of condition assessments. The other is we can take coupons when we undertake repairs or put in new services. So whenever we're in the ground and we have the pipe uncovered, and particularly when we'll be able to take a sample of it, we can do so and have that assessed, and then build a database of those results. So that's something that we're looking at as well. So a combination of potentially doing some type of visual inspections from the inside of the pipe, but also taking coupons and samples from the pipe when we have the opportunity to do so, and have those assessed to tell us
Its integrity.
Its integrity, and provide more information about whether it's good for its age or poor for its age or what. Yeah.
And what is the standard nowadays? Is it PVC? It seems to be what the city's all putting in.
Yeah, new pipe installed would be PVC.
And what's the estimated lifespan for them?
Yeah, so approximately 80 years, whereas we're using 60 years for the asbestos cement.
So what would make PVC degrade? Just the chlorination in the water, or because it's not getting sunlight?
Yeah, no, it is just an age thing. It hasn't been in the ground that long to test it. They have sample sites at pipe manufacturing companies where they have huge acres of fields where they have steel, PVC, they have all the different types of material in the ground, and where they're constantly testing the degradation rate. And right now PVC is kind of the standard for distribution.
You'd think it would be kind of bulletproof if it's not getting UV'd, but there is chlorination in the water, so it might react with some of it.
I think for some of these newer pipe materials, the industry is likely being conservative in the estimates of lifespans. So
I would think, yeah.
HDP is another example of that. It hasn't been around for more than 20 or 30 years. And they're currently estimating it as an 80-year lifespan. But the expectation is that as time goes by, that that'll likely be proved to be quite conservative.
So then that leads to the argument that we heard at the previous meeting that, we should at least consider punting this ahead and replacing it through borrowing in some regards, because the interest rates are so low, and it is the next generation are going to benefit from it. So rather than making the users pay today, maybe there's some way of balancing it so that you kick some of it down the road 20 years.
So sorry, just to be clear, the asbestos cement pipe it's well known. The lifespan is well known. The PVC and the HDPE fall into that other category.
No,
we've got a fairly good understanding of how long the asbestos cement will last.
Yeah,
Can I ask a question regarding a public info session? Just want to make sure that our understanding of that would be as an information session rather than an opportunity for consultation. So it would be informing and providing the opportunity to ask questions and have the rationale explained rather than an opportunity to provide input that would influence the direction.
No, staff take all the abuse. We just stand back and look very,
Either way, that's, yeah.
Director. Oh, sorry, I had you there.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I think an information session would do it. And in terms of where my mind goes, and because it is a dilemma, really, it really is philosophies, right? Around, like Director Grief said, do you just wait a bit or punt it out or wait? When I think about the rationale as to why I would buy into planned maintenance and all the rest of that is words like, this is an essential service, right? So it's a critical, essential service for the public. It doesn't mean that we'll take the same approach with everything, with buses and with all types of different projects that the CVRD does. Now, we are applying asset management, but I might have different philosophies based on what the object of the day is. And in terms of water, I'll remain supportive of a planned approach, and I feel comfortable, talking it up with residents. But yeah, an information session for sure, and of course people will comment in those sessions, and as long as it's clear as to why we are adopting that philosophy, which is a more cautious approach, to me it goes back to that essential service and
Yes.
water being that critical ingredient.
I just wrote that down before you said it. Essential service and health,
Yeah,
public health.
yeah.
So it's paramount.
There you go.
Top of the drawer.
Yeah.
So seeing nothing else, we'll vote on receipt. All in favor? Carries. Thank you. Now the recommendation. Do we want to move it or amend it, or?
I'll move the recommendation.
You'll move it as it sits?
I'll second.
Okay. So no discussion on softening the 9%? We got 3 more years before we have to face the public anyway. Hi, Mom. Okay, moving second on recommendation. All in favor? That carries. Way easier than my last committee. Asset management planning for the Royston Water Local Service Area for receipt. Moving second on receipt. Back over to Chris.
Thank you. So I won't bore you with the pretty much exactly the same presentation as the last one. I'll jump forward to the differences. Just bear with me for 1 minute. Should we wait?
Go ahead, I think.
Okay.
It's Roy's turn.
Okay. The last service was, as I mentioned, was almost entirely linear in ground infrastructure. Royston's a little different. We've got some reservoirs. That's really the key difference, and some more PRVs, but no treatment infrastructure other than some rechlorination. So two reservoir sites, several PRVs, and again, a lot of asbestos cement in the ground. So here's the asset risk graphic. Again, displaying a combination of the consequence of failure and the probability of failure. So purple, again, as we learned during the last presentation, are items that have been identified as the highest risk items in the service, but not necessarily needing replacement imminently. Sure. So again, purple is a display of the highest rated infrastructure in terms of risk for the service, but not necessarily requiring replacement immediately. And some infrastructure here in the Meredith Drive area to keep an eye on. So here's the asset replacement schedule for Royston. So as I mentioned at the earlier slide, well, there is a little bit more non-lineal infrastructure associated with this service. The reservoirs and chambers and kiosks. But again, still the bulk of the infrastructure is the linear type. So in this service, AECOM is recommending, based on that asset replacement schedule, within this 20 years, for an annual average of $500,000 of investment for the service. And looking at it with the distributed model undertaken by Econics, provides a smoothed out asset replacement schedule. This is for 25 years. So I believe this would be the threshold for the 20-year horizon that's shown by AECOM in theirs. But again, those 3 big years that represent 60 years from when that asbestos cement was installed by the Royston Improvement District are now smoothed out in the Econics model to something that more closely reflects the actual replacement schedule that we'd be driven to by either by increasing risks of those pipes or by increasing failures. And I made a note in response to some of the questions and comments from the previous presentation that it would be useful to overlay a line on this graph here that shows the increase in maintenance, operations and maintenance costs associated with the infrastructure as the ESL goes by, because there is definitely an expectation and understanding that the cost of maintaining that infrastructure increases significantly as the age increases. So for linear infrastructure, that would be an increase in the number of repairs being undertaken on certain areas. And there's a certain point at which, and this is something that will be aided significantly with the implementation of our computerized maintenance management system. At a certain point, the cost of maintaining or repairing that line will, exceed the cost of replacing it, or of debt servicing for the replacement, or the impacts to rates.
Director Amir, you have a question now?
I can wait if there's something.
Either way.
Yeah, I'm fine either way.
Okay.
If you, yeah.
Or a philosophical one, not just around Royston.
I like philosophy.
Yeah, there you go. So, I'm going to echo Director Arbor's comments. I'm glad that we are doing this and that ACON has been able to provide us with, all of this critical information. I'm wondering how this, knowing all of this now, would impact our decisions and our pricing going forward if a new service was added to, like if we were to take over new already existing services. Do we have staff thought about, do we implement an asset management cost immediately when we take on a new service? And so then that cost would be reflected right up front for everybody? Or, but who does the assessment though? Do we hire ACON, or would this asset manager have the skills to do that for us?
When it comes to new services, for instance, taking over Union Bay Improvement District or otherwise, there is an assessment of the works that is made. As the board moves forward and adopts policies with respect to asset management, that will definitely inform us to educate those ratepayers or otherwise that might be contemplating it, what they're getting into.
Yeah.
What the expectation is of current, weighing current users versus future borrowing or otherwise. What your approach will be to resolving those issues. That will definitely be helpful. But before we do take on a system, there is definitely an assessment made as to the age and nature and material of all the infrastructure, and that will happen for you.
And that would be hired out, or is the asset manager?
That is hired out, sorry,
okay.
yeah.
Oh. Director Arbor, you got a question?
No, sorry, I was just looking at it for a number there, just to compare. So that recommended annual average investment by AECOM of $500,000 compared to the average in the next 4 years of the current 5-year financial plan was 130,000, just to provide that difference. So just looking at so similar to the last service, although at a much smaller scale, this service is facing the biggest hump over the next 100 years. Is occurring again towards the end of this first 20-year period. However, it is not quite as pronounced as with the Service 305, the Comox Valley, and it's I guess that's a reflection of some larger elements of that distribution system having been added on a little bit more recently. So that it's more of a double hump rather than a single big one as we saw in the 305. So again, the recommendations provided by AECOM will be taking them into consideration. Some of them are already being implemented, such as the implementation of the CMMS, that's across all of the water groups. And we'll be focusing on that detailed rate analysis for Royston over the coming year. And we're recommending the same level of rate increase here for Royston as we are on the 305. And that was it for the presentation.
Director Arbor.
Good. So I guess I'll save the philosophy because we've covered it. Supportive of this approach, but there's a couple of other factors, I guess, in regards to the Royston service that raises interest and questions for me. So one which will be subject to a future staff report, I guess, is the need to change the water source for the Royston service from Cumberland to Comox Lake. And we know there will be costs associated with that, which are not, unless I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure I'm not wrong, but they're not integrated in this report, those future costs.
They're not integrated into this report. However, we, as I mentioned, we are already getting started on the financial modeling, and we've included those estimates in there. And to be honest, they have in part influenced our recommendation for the scale of the rate increase required now.
So you would have been more aggressive if we were keeping the same water source in terms of rate increases?
No, I think we probably would have been less aggressive.
Less aggressive?
Less aggressive if it hadn't been for that prospect of the $6 million, approximately $6 million cost associated with the transfer of water supply from Cumberland to the region. And so that is part of the context, although it's not captured in the AECOM report because it's not existing infrastructure. However, when we as we're transitioning from that report over to the financial modeling, we've certainly included that, and it's highlighting when you combine, although the asset replacement schedule is showing a kind of a prettier picture than 305, when you layer on the addition of that new source, it looks quite similar in terms of the required rate increases. Yeah.
So, and are we expecting those reports still before Christmas or something like that? So, because what I'm thinking is, say that we do decide to do an information session. We'll do the rate increase now. There's a newsletter that goes out, information session. I would love it if for the Royston service we had all that information in hand, both in regards to the options around the source transfer and as well as this asset management. Would that be presented in an integrated way at that time?
To be honest, we hadn't planned to, but could we? I guess we'd have to just put our mind to what information we would need to have nailed down in order to bring it forward into the public sphere. I think we could certainly
think about it.
Okay. Yeah,
that's fair enough.
I see the merit, though, absolutely.
And the second external factor that I'm considering, and again, this one is outside a bit the purview of this one, but could still be relevant. If you go back to the graph of when the infrastructure has to be turned over, so the big blue bars?
Yeah.
Okay. So we see that in 2034, 2035, so it's from 2034 to 2038, which will be my last years in office.
You'd be as old as me.
I'm kind of, my question is, at that point, are we just, digging up all that asbestos cement and replacing it by PVC? Is this like just bring the excavator on the streets and do the works? Is that the kind of thinking around this change, or do you see it as being more progressive, or how would a project like that be implemented? So is it a one-time kind of big mega project that for 2 years we replace all the pipes?
No, very likely not.
Okay.
So when you moving from that graph to this one,
Yeah.
this you would expect it to follow more closely this curve, although it could be that as we approach that time. So this curve.
So this is gradual
This
replacement?
is gradual replacement, like a replacement program. It's easier to handle internally from a staff resource perspective. It's arguably less impactful and easier to manage from a operational nature as well. So it's more likely that it would occur as a series of smaller projects.
The reason why I bring it up, which is my external factor, wouldn't there be potential significant cost savings if we did all the works at once and put in sewer lines at the same time?
So I guess in terms of doing it all at once for water, you could expect some savings just from mobilization and demobilization costs from contractors. How that would compare to the additional costs of managing, ensuring water delivery during such a major project, hard to say. Layering on the sewer piece, it's also possible. I mean, the sewer and water lines have to be separated by a minimum distance and within separate trenches. So that's a tough one. We would have to take a look at it to look for synergies. I think that would definitely, it would make sense to do that type of analysis, but we haven't done that yet. But that is a caution, the fact that they would need to be separate trenches, and therefore that
Sure.
would magnify the impact on the community.
I'm just raising
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and if staff comes back and think that there's value, we can discuss it more. But
Thank you.
it's definitely the kind of question for me that, if we're planning for sewer, I know we're going to try for sewer sooner, but sometimes, if you say, hey, in 15 years from now, we're going to have this massive water replacement, time it with that, that can also be a pitch to the public to prepare for that and to start socking monies away and get our governments on board around. I'm just thinking out loud, right? Otherwise, I'm quite happy to go to Royston. And again, I think when I talk to constituents, not a ton of them, I haven't done a ton of consultation, but from the people I've talked to around Royston, I think I often hear that they feel the water service has been affordable. I'm not hearing a lot of people saying that it's been outrageous over the years, the rate. So I think this will be well received, and the thinking behind it as well. So I thank you for this work.
Thank you, Director. At the very least, we should make sure we have a very close relationship with MOTI when we start digging up the roads. The same thought about putting in sewer pipes when you put in the water pipes, and then pave it when it needs to be paved on the Clarkson Drive up in Saratoga Beach. I mean, that would be the ideal way to go forward. And I remember talking to Kevin Carter when he was at MOTI there about that, because they were thinking of doing it sooner than later. And I was saying, well, maybe give us a chance. At the very least, talk to our engineering department. They might be wanting to put new water pipes in or something at that point, right? But, I think you made a good point about forewarning people that these infrastructure costs are coming. When you talk about sewer services, I think that's where we fall down, is that we don't lead people through the pathway. We don't say, okay, that we're going to be putting money away for the eventuality, maybe have a small service, you start putting some reserves away so that, that in 8, 10, 15 years, whatever, we're going to be doing this work. so it gets people's minds around it, so they don't rush out and put in a new $30,000 on-site septic system. But I mean, just forewarn people, bring them through the, we're going down the stairway. Okay, we're at the bottom of the stairway, there's a door. We're going to turn the door handle, we're going to open the door, we're going to go through the door. It's as simple as that. I think it would help a lot, because then people can't say they weren't forewarned, that they didn't see this coming. And I go back to that whole thing at the strategic plan about the Anna Stark presentation about ballot initiatives in the States, and how it takes 3, sometimes 4 attempts before people come to the conclusion, this is inevitable, it's costing us more money every year, let's do it. And they finally vote through whatever the public initiative is. So, anything else, gents and ladies, on receipt, all in favor? Okay, that passes. Moving on to recommendation. Any discussion on the recommendation? You don't want to see the contract, or maybe revisit the award of the contract? Pardon me? Yeah, I guess we should. You're darn tootins. I'll put you on here, hold on. This mouth is, there, got you.
So I'll recommend that bylaw number 111, being the Royston Water Service Regulation, Fees and Charges bylaw 2010, be amended to include a 9% rate increase to the basic fee and all tier rates effective April 1st, 2020. And I would like to add, if I may, for asset management purposes. Would that be fine?
Is it seconded? Yeah, then it's in there. Any discussion? While we're still at the meeting, I just have one query. If we are talking of switching the water source for the Royston system, would that not be in partnership with our Comox First Nation and their initiatives?
Yes, there's definitely overlap between those projects. So that would be one aspect that we would want to go in and think about, just in terms of messaging potentially to a Royston info session, and how that overlaps with our current work with KFN and potentially another partner on that extension of water services south.
And as we heard from former Minister George Abbott, the chances of success in working with First Nations is greatly increased. Mm-hmm. Okay. On the recommendation, all in favor? That carries. I see no further business. Termination, all in favor? And I'd like to thank